Welcome to Seminole Sidelines. We are honored to be joined by David Hale of ESPN today. It's finally game week. That feels pretty monumental after a long off season. David, how's it going?
It is going excellently. I am thrilled to have some football games. I'm bummed that I will not be in Ireland, but it might be for the best. I'm not sure that I would make it back from Ireland. So it's, would I love to be going on the trip? Yes. Is it best that they don't send me somewhere with just insane access to Irish whiskey and Guinness? Yes, it is also best for that.
I'll have an extra Guinness over there for you, David. I will.
Thank you.
It's very, very selfless act of me. I think I want to start out. I mean, we want to be looking forward with this, but I'm interested. You're in such a unique position covering the ACC so heavily, kind of national, but an ACC focus for ESPN. I'm curious, kind of your perspective on covering the playoff and the snub last December and being so close to the Florida State ACC side of it.
I mean, I was very frustrated, and it had nothing to do with the fact that I covered the ACC or that I spent a lot of time around that Florida State team last year, and it was a uniquely fun team to be around with uniquely good chemistry and guys like Jared Verse and Braden Fisk that had given their all to a program. I had covered Jordan Travis's story, from start to finish in a lot of ways. And it was so, I mean, yes, of course, I had a personal vested interest in I hate seeing those particular people who I like getting screwed over. But from a much larger viewpoint, I find the idea of a bunch of people in a boardroom saying what they think should happen, exceeding what actually happened on the field, to be undermining everything that sports is about. And so for me, it was never I'm in it for FSU, or, I don't see, I see the logic in saying, without Jordan Travis, on paper, Alabama beats Florida State. That's probably true. But the whole freaking point is that games get played on the field and not on paper. And I had watched enough of Alabama last year too to say, I didn't think that was a great team. It was a pretty good team. It was one of the worst Nick Saban teams that they've had. I was very frustrated with a narrative that was so much based off of a popularity contest, a beauty contest, whatever the Vegas point spread might be, that people didn't step back and say, wait a minute, we wouldn't stand for this in any other sport. You don't get to just say, I think the two best NFL teams are the, Chiefs and the Eagles, so we're going to put them in the Super Bowl. That's not how it works. And so I was just really frustrated with the lack of context. Outcome is the outcome, and frankly, was the playoff set up to give that board enough wiggle room to effectively do whatever the hell they want every year? Yes, that's exactly what it was set up to be. And because it was the last year that they were going to have four, there were effectively no repercussions or precedent set. All of those things are true. But I feel like our network and others really missed the boat in sort of providing the type of genuine sports fan, not in the weeds, I talk to the guys in the room, I'm friends with coaches conversation, but the viewpoint of an average sports fan who cares about what sports and competition are all about. And moreover, yes, I was invested in the individual players in that locker room because I knew them. But I would have felt that way for any team that got screwed, and it sucks to work as hard as they did all year to get that not even all year, because you think about the larger story of what it took for Mike Norvell and some of those guys in that locker room, Kalen DeLoach and Jordan Travis and those guys, to get that program from where it was in 2020 to where it is now, and to essentially have a bunch of people in, the airport Marriott basically say, I don't think you're good enough. That's really shitty, in my opinion.
Really threw you into the deep end on that one.
Look, I know there's been lots of conversations about whose voices get heard on ESPN, and ESPN sort of becomes the default metric for these things. And I'm a little bit of an apologist for ESPN because I think that everybody's frustrations get hung on ESPN when there is, I mean, we are maybe the biggest outlet, but there are dozens of big outlets with big voices out there, and I don't think anybody did a really good job of telling this story the way it needed to be told.
The good news, I mean, you talked about it. The good news is, as unfortunate as that was, it was the last time that could happen where, I mean, going forward, the ACC champ in the 12-team playoff is always going to be in. So I guess pivoting to looking ahead, I guess, starting at the broadest scale, what is your 10,000 feet view of the ACC? Obviously, a new look ACC with some new teams, an ACC in conflict with a few teams actively suing the conference. What is it as wide open as some people seem to think it is in terms of contenders?
I think it is to some extent. Look, we've had other years where we think like, there's these, NC State's the perennial, like, hey, maybe this is the year that it all comes together, and it doesn't. We've told the Miami story many, many times. It's interesting because in a 4-team era, I think it was quite clear, and the Pac-12 is the poster child for this, that it is better to have 1, 2, or 3 very good teams and everybody else mediocre or worse than to have 7 or 8 very good teams that beat up on each other. Like, the better play was to have a top-heavy league because it got you into the playoff. What does that look like in a 12-team playoff era? Because I think the ACC is not top-heavy. I'm not sure there is a genuinely great team. Like, I think, bluntly, if you took Miami's players and put them in a Florida State uniform, I think people would be picking them without question right now. They got a lot of dudes, but we know the Miami history. We know the Mario Cristobal history. We know Cam Ward's history. So it's hard. There's skepticism there. Florida State and Clemson, I think, fall into a very similar story in which those defenses are probably both top 10 in the country, if not top 3 in the country. But I got questions about what the quarterback and the passing game look like on both sides. NC State, this is, and I've been around that team a lot for a decade now under Dave Doran, this is the most talented team that they've had. Again, that's a team that bumps its head on 9 wins every year and doesn't get past it. I love the way that Virginia Tech finished last season, but that was still a 7-6 team. There's, I think, a long way to go. Louisville played for an ACC championship last year with a below-average quarterback. If Tyler Shuck is healthy for the whole year, which is, again, a huge if, Jeff Brown's as good a coach as there is in the country, and they're going to win a lot of football games again. The one nobody's talking about that I think is worth part of the conversation, because they lost Drake May and they don't have the big name brand quarterback this year, but Carolina is much better up front on both sides of the line of scrimmage. Max Johnson, I think, is underrated he has been put in some bad positions. Haynes King's a perfect example of when you take the quarterback away from Jimbo, things get better for the quarterback. And then their schedule, like, whatever you want to put FPI into, but they're a favorite per FPI in 10 of their 12 games. And then one of the ones that they're not is NC State, and that's basically a toss-up game for them. So UNC has a chance to win a bunch of games, and they play better when nobody's talking about them. So, like, I'm looking at this league, and I say bare minimum it's 7 deep, and that's if you don't even want to get into Syracuse and SMU and schools like that. So is that good for the ACC that you've got a bunch of good teams? Like, it sort of depends because, again, I'm not sure what the window is for the ACC getting more than one school in. And part of the problem with that is the larger narrative that has dogged the ACC for years and years. Part of it is they and the Big 12 just agreed that they deserve a smaller piece of playoff pie because they're not as good as the other leagues. Like, that's an insane thing to have agreed to, particularly when you're making a direct comparison with the Big Ten, who has done nothing to prove it is a better league than the ACC on the field. But, like, that narrative, like, they essentially just said, like, yeah, the narrative's kind of right. Now, I will say, I think how this narrative plays out at the end of the season, last year is a great example of defaulting to what people just automatically easy believe. But the way the ACC challenges that narrative is Clemson plays Georgia in week 1, and Clemson has a chance to make some noise. NC State plays Tennessee in week 2, and NC State has a chance to make some noise. There's another one. Oh, Miami and Florida. Like, Miami has to win that game. And then you get to the end of the season and you have those traditional SEC, ACC crossover games. And frankly, the ACC If the season plays out as we would expect it to, we'll be favored in 3 of the 4 of those games. Like, you've got to win those. Louisville has to do their part against Kentucky, because part of the conversation around FSU is that ACC championship game that FSU dominated defensively got dinged because Louisville had just lost to Kentucky, which they had no business doing. So everybody else needs to do their part a little bit in changing the narrative. And if the ACC can get 2 in, I think there's going to be teams that belong in that, hey, I think we should deserve a wild card berth. The problem is, and God, I'm not looking forward to it, there is going to be a lot of 9-3 from the SEC is worth a whole lot more than 10-2 from the ACC.
Oh, it's 100% right. I mean, that is the problem as we're pivoting to this. Is I've been convinced all along that more often than not, it's going to be, you're going to get 3 teams from outside the Big 2 conferences, if you will. You get the minimum, and that you won't get a 4th team in. I'd love to be proven wrong, but I just don't see it. You talked about DJ. Obviously, we've been talking about DJ for months. We've talked it to death. I think we're all ready to see it in motion and stop talking about it. You are probably one of the better people to talk to in terms of, I mean, you've known him, had a relationship with him, covered him for years, first at Clemson, now back at FSU. I'm curious, I guess, what you made of this move when you heard it was happening, when kind of there was the motion of DJ to FSU, and your concerns, maybe him in the offense, and maybe are there some things you think Mike Norvell can tap into him?
Yeah, my thoughts on DJ. First of all, I think he is a great person. Like, he's handled a very rocky career as much as anybody. And I say rocky both on and off the field. He has had a lot of challenges to deal with over the course of his time in college. He has tremendous raw talent. That goes without saying. And that raw talent that followed Trevor Lawrence at Clemson, we got the sneak peek of against BC and Notre Dame back in 2020. All of that sort of led to this, he's going to be the next big thing. And I think it's okay to say he's not. It's okay to just say DJ is who he's been. I mean, because he's basically been almost the same guy for the last 2.5 years, and we keep expecting him to be something different. So I think you've got to go into this season with the expectation that, DJ is DJ. He'll probably be what he was last year and maybe 5 or 10% better in a good scenario. That's okay. Because I don't think that Florida State I don't think they need Jordan Travis, but everybody should understand this is going to look a lot different. You can't plug DJ into Jordan's role and say it all looks the same. It won't. I think if you go back to Mike Norvell's Memphis days, though, DJ probably looks a lot more like, Riley Ferguson and those guys that he had there, and could fit an offensive style that he played there. That's, I think, perfectly comfortable for Mike Norvell. So that's fine. The biggest concern that I have, well, 2. One is what happens if it doesn't go well quickly for DJ, because the narrative can turn very quickly. And again, he's been through it before. Certainly when you're approaching Clemson week, it's going to be a lot. And then 2, what's the receiving core look like? Because I think DJ has shown that he is real good at hitting an open receiver for a big play. What he's not necessarily great at is throwing a receiver open. And so how many guys does Florida State have in that receiving core that can consistently get open, can win a one-on-one matchup and get open and not just be fighting for 50-50 balls, not kind of scaring DJ off from throwing a ball because the window isn't quite there. That to me is probably as big a concern as anything DJ can or can't do. It's that you need receivers that are going to play to his strengths, and I'm not 100% convinced FSU has that right now.
Yeah, that transitions to you. You've started your ACC positional rankings this year, and Florida State's receivers, tight ends, not especially high on that list. And I'll be honest, from what I've seen this preseason, I think that's valid. I think the potential is there, but you need a lot of guys to take that step, and we haven't seen it. I know you haven't done the running backs yet. I have to imagine the running backs be much higher on that list of kind of where they stack up in the ACC. I guess, what do you make of the offensive skilled talent on this roster?
Well, I mean, and I've talked to guys at FSU about this, and it almost as someone like you and I who have been around this program for a number of years now, the strength is going to be the offensive line, which is an insane thing to think after so many years of it being the absolute low point of Florida State's roster. But this is a team that is going to be winning and losing games up front. And that's probably true on both sides of the ball, though. I think they're deep in some other areas on defense too. But they're going to run the ball. I think, like the week 0 matchup against Georgia Tech plays really well for Florida State because Georgia Tech struggled badly to stop the run last year. So this is a test where, like, if FSU struggles to run the ball against Georgia Tech, that's a big red flag. But they should be able to run the football. And then you use play action, you open some things up. You keep you bring another defender into the box to stop the run, and that opens some things up for DJ. That should play well. But again, like, you don't want to be one-dimensional. And that was one of the beauties of Jordan Travis, is you were never one-dimensional with Jordan Travis, because he added a third dimension that very few other quarterbacks present. And so how does Florida State look when you don't have a magician playing quarterback? And can you force a team when a defense says, like, we're going to take away the thing that you want to do? Is there an effective plan B? That, to me, is the biggest question around Florida State's offense right now.
No, it's completely. I mean, can I ask? Can you give a spoiler? Is Florida State, is it the best offensive line in the ACC on your list?
Yeah, I haven't done my full research on it yet, but just off the top of my head, I would probably say them, Miami, and Louisville would be my top 3. Though I think North Carolina has made some big strides this year as well. They've brought in some dudes via the portal, but they're less experienced than Florida State's guys are. So, Miami's got 2 dudes on their at tackle that are going to be playing in the NFL and probably first or second round picks in the NFL. So Miami's real good there too. But 1 through 5 across, and then the depth. I think Florida State's. I mean, they check a lot of boxes.
How crazy? You think back to 2018-19? How crazy is that?
I mean, there was probably a number of high school teams in the state of Florida that would have had no problem running over that Florida State offensive line back in 2018. It is insane that we're here now. But again, this is people have really tried to knock Mike Norvell for the way he has acquired talent for this roster using the portal. He's used the portal better than anybody, and there's really a depth of talent that has come from the high school ranks now that I think people are slow to catch up on how good he has been at not just bringing in good, talented players, but bringing in the right guys. Because in addition to the O-line being a train wreck, the culture in that locker room was an absolute catastrophe, and it's not anymore. So, I brought this up a few times. I was really taken back last year at the ACC championship game. Somebody asked Jeff Brom how he approaches the portal, and Brom's done a very nice job with talent acquisition through the portal too. And he basically said he follows his dad's rule of thumb, which is, I find the best guys, and then I try to get them to come play for me. And that's a great philosophy. It's not Mike Norvell's philosophy, though. He finds guys who are very good, but that fit what he wants the culture of a team to be. And he's very, very prescribed in how he brings in the right people. It's, I think, tremendously underappreciated how good he has been at this.
Flipping to the other side of the ball, I think even with all Florida State's loss to the NFL on the defense, I think we thought coming into preseason, and from what I've seen, is definitely validated. I think the defense can be a real strength of this team as well. What do you make of that side of the ball?
I mean, it's very hard for me to say you remove Braden Fisk and Jared Verse from a defensive line and it gets better. Those 2 guys, the last 2 games of the year, that is as dominant. That is essentially both of them turned into Forrest Whitaker in Fast Times at Ridgemont High after they destroyed his car. They were just I will kill you now. And I've never seen 2 players on a defense that just utterly dominated back-to-back games to that level. It was insane. Having said all that, there's probably more depth on the D-line this year, and there's certainly ample upside with some of those. I mean, Josh Farmer and Patrick Payton and Marvin Jones Jr. and Daryl Jack, those are some dudes. So I will not be at all surprised if this defensive front is as good as it was a year ago. The linebacking crew, I think, is coming along. DJ Lundy, I think, was very good in a smaller role last year. We'll see what happens as that expands. I'm not sure how the depth is at linebacker. Boy, you talked to Mike Norvell about the secondary, though, and I mean, I'm not even sure the last number he used. He might have said, I got 64 guys that I feel good about back there. He's very, very pleased with the depth in the secondary. And who am I to argue with Mike Norvell about this? And, of course, Isaiah Thomas, I think, is probably, going to be an All-American candidate by the end of the year. This might be a better defense front to back this year than it was last year. More talented anyway. And I'll say I think like the upside might be higher than it was last year, which is a little bit crazy to say.
Yeah, when you pair AZ with Fentrell Cypress, who was the All-ACC player of Virginia, I think has looked more like that this preseason, I guess. Where do you think that cornerback duo could stack up in the ACC, maybe even nationally?
Yeah, and I mean, you look at some of the other teams that are like the top contenders. Like Clemson's got some really talented players at corner, but they're young. Miami, that's probably their biggest question mark is their defensive backfield. NC State is pretty good there. I will say NC State, like Aiden White is a really good player. Virginia Tech's pretty good in the secondary. I would be hard-pressed, though, to say that there's a team that I would definitively rank ahead of Florida State just off the top of my head. Like Virginia Tech and NC State would probably be the next step on my list, but I would just, again, without having deep dived on it at this point, I would say Florida State's probably number one there.
So you talked a little earlier about looking at Georgia Tech. I think this team, as many questions as there are, it will benefit them greatly not starting the season with an LSU again, like they have the last couple of years, and getting to maybe ease into things a bit. But obviously, GT, no cakewalk by any means. It's a team that got a lot better as last year went on and returns a lot off that team. You talked about maybe the run game you would think being something that will go in Florida State's favor in that game. I guess what are some areas of concern that you have for Florida State going into that game that Georgia Tech might be able to exploit?
Well, number one is Haynes King's really mobile, and they like to get him outside of the pocket, and they like to let him run the ball, and he can really scramble out of trouble. So you've got to be extremely disciplined up front because he will burn you. Number two, they've got some wide receiving depth that I think, again, that's not a bad matchup for Florida State because I think Florida State's very good in the secondary, but this is not going to be a game where I think Florida State's secondary just immediately out-talents the guys that they're trying to guard. And then, frankly, I mean, Georgia Tech is probably one of the better offensive lines that they're going to see this year. So, again, I think it's a good test for that new look defensive front. These are all matchups that Florida State can win and probably on paper should win. Like, they're no doubt the more talented team. But Georgia Tech is far from a pushover, particularly on offense. It would not surprise me if they're able to put up, a handful of points. So then it's, can you run the ball effectively? And look, Georgia Tech, their secondary is not great. DJ needs to throw the ball effectively against Georgia Tech in this game because if they don't, even if you win this game, but you come out of it and DJ was 12 for 25 for 140 yards, like people are going to start getting concerned. And I will say too, you're getting that defensive front is going to be challenged, not just this week 1 or week 0 against Haynes King, but then you get Thomas Castellanos in week 2 or what is week 1. And we all remember what he did to Florida State's defense last year too. Get comfortable with a quarterback who can make you look silly with his legs. That's going to be the first 2 games right off the bat for Florida State.
We've talked about them a little bit as we've talked about the talented units across the ACC. I've kind of got to ask you here. Are you buying the Miami hype? Is this the year? I mean, it feels like it almost has to be the year for Mario. Is this the year where maybe they are there in Charlotte and maybe even get it done?
To me, this is all about the emotional component of college football for Miami because the physical talent is unquestionably there. Like even compared to other years where we said like Miami looks pretty good this year. No, like these guys are different. Like again, I go back and talk to coaches all the time and they say like, look, there's lots of ways you can win, but the easiest way is to have NFL caliber dudes in as many places as you can. Miami's got NFL caliber dudes in a lot of places. So what do you do with that? Well, I think Cam Ward has been a really good, and I'll add to this. I think NC State's a little bit in the same boat. They both brought in quarterbacks with a level of like swagger and confidence to them that those programs desperately needed. Like Cam Ward expects to win. And I think that is infectious within a locker room. And part of it, I know this has been true at NC State. I think there's a little bit of it at Miami too of like, when's the other shoe going to drop? Like good things aren't supposed to happen to us. Well, you now have the leader in your locker room saying like, yes, not only are good things supposed to happen to us, like it's effed up if we don't have good things happen to us. Something went wrong. But things are going to go wrong over the course of the season. Like that just happens. So how does Miami respond when they get punched? How does Miami respond to adversity? Like last year when that Georgia Tech game happened, like those guys specifically, Jalen Rivers said, we never forgot it the rest of the year. It hung over us like an anchor the rest of the year. Like Miami can't be that this year. How emotionally ready are they to win at the highest level? Because again, you look at Florida State last year, and that was a team that had the worst possible thing in the world happen to them against an opponent that you probably should have not even had Jordan Travis on the field for. And that team responded. Like, how does Miami respond when things go bad? That's the part of the puzzle that I can't answer because I have to see it first. But I will say, physically, on paper, this is a really, really good football team. So I think there's 4 teams that have legitimate championship odds. Like I think there's probably 3 or 4 others that could be in the mix if everything goes right. I'm saying there's 4 teams that everything doesn't have to go perfect and they can still make it there, and Miami's absolutely one of them. The others being Florida State, Clemson, and NC State.
Yeah, I want to ask about Clemson too. Obviously, a unique situation there with kind of unsure what to make of. I mean, is this them finding their level? Is this a blip? Like, what do you make of where that program is right now going into 2024?
It's a great question. And I don't – look, Dabo's got 2 rings on his hand, so I'm not here to say, like, this is a season that is going to define him. It won't. But Dabo is sort of the one still sort of thumbing his nose at the transition of college football as it is. And maybe that's okay. It's to me, I don't think that you have to knock the way he does things. I mean, it's sort of like I'm gonna build a baseball team like the Rays as opposed to the Yankees. You know, like you do it. There's more than one way to win. But his way is drawing a lot of attention, and I think he's got to prove that it is the smart way to do things, not just because he likes it that way, but because it's actually good for Clemson. A lot of this is going to come down to the receiving core. Now, yes, a lot of it comes down to Cade Klubnik, and I think Cade Klubnik has a lot more upside than he showed last year. I think there's a whole other conversation about it's sort of one of my pet projects is this quarterback class from 2022 with Drew Aller and Cade Klubnik and Connor Wegman and Malik Murphy. Like these guys who just have not developed like we would have expected, but they also, their junior year in high school was a COVID year, and I think it's put them behind the 8 ball on a lot of things. That's a long story to unpack. So, but I think there's a higher ceiling for Cade Klubnik than we've seen. But wide receiver is exactly the position that they have needed help the last few years. Dabo hasn't gotten it through the portal. He still didn't get it through the portal, but he has these 2 genuinely 5-star blue chip recruit receivers coming in as true freshmen this year, who he thinks will be difference makers. So Brian Wesco, TJ Moore, are they difference makers? Do they open up this passing game that has been so abysmal really for the last 3 years and turn it into something that looks more like when Clemson was claiming to be wide receiver U with T. Higgins and Mike Williams and Amari Rodgers and all of those guys? Like that to me is going to tell the story of whether the Dabo's approach can be effective at the highest level.
Yeah, last question for you, David. Appreciate you very much taking the time. I'm wondering if I can put you on the spot a week out from the season. I guess what do you have as far as maybe an FSU record prediction, and what 2 teams are you circling right now if you had to pick 2 for Charlotte for the ACC title game?
I'm trying to decide because I'm a little indifferent, or not indifferent. I'm a little torn on who I want to pick, and I've kind of gone back and forth on things. When we filled out our media survey at ACC kickoff, I had Florida State at the top, but I've done a lot more digging. We've gotten to see teams through camp now. I was on with Bob Valvano on Louisville radio yesterday, and I picked Clemson and Miami to play for the ACC championship. I'm not sure I did. Like I can make a very sound case for this, but I'm also doing a Florida State podcast, so let me take it all back. I'll say Florida State and Clemson are going to play for the ACC championship.
Hey, that would be a great one. David, I appreciate very much taking the time. Thank God football is we're a week away, basically, as we sit here and record this Friday afternoon.
I'm going to start drinking my Guinness just to prepare internally for.
You can be in Ireland in your mind. I don't think anybody will hold that against you.
That's the new 5 o'clock somewhere. You're in Ireland in your mind.
Hey, there you go. All right. I appreciate it very much, David.
Yep.